Call this meeting of the Salem-Keizer School Board to order November 28th, 6 p.m. We are in the Student Services Building, 2575 Commercial Street Southeast. We will now do the flag salute.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. It appears all board members are present except Mr. Lee. So, agenda modifications, are there any? I don't know of any. Anyone? Anyone? Okay. We can move on then. Action items, it's my understanding there are none at this point in time. So we will move on to the next item, which would be the bond discussion, and I will turn it over to the superintendent.
All right, so you have a packet of materials for tonight that we will go as far into, or we will stop at what is a logical stopping point when you kind of get fatigued with information. So Michael Wolfe is going to walk you through all of that. We'll go as deep into things as you need along the way. And again, we have 3 meetings scheduled over the course of this week, so we have time, but we wanted to be as prepared as possible for tonight to get as far as we could tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to get us started.
Great. Good evening. So just wanted to start off by saying there's a lot of information, and we'll go over I'll orient you to the packet and kind of the flow over the next few nights, and how we'll wrap up everything we're scheduled to wrap everything up on Monday the 4th, December 4th. And so, as Superintendent Perry said, we can dive in as deep as you would like to go tonight. We're fully prepared to talk through 2 of the topical areas. And we have other information that's flowing towards us that we'll have for Thursday, and then yet again a little bit more for the 4th on Monday too. So if we don't have it, then we can tell you when we'll provide it, and we'll go from there. First of all, I'd like to say this is pretty exciting stuff when you think about the fact that this is really the culmination of almost a 3-year journey for the district. The long-range facility plan really got kicked off way back when we implemented full-day K. And we needed to really take a look at how much capacity we had in our elementary schools to be able to do that. And then all the way through the Citizens Facility Task Force, and then the base bond proposal and the recommendations, the polling, the conceptual design review meetings with staff, and then most recently the listening and learning session. So we're trying to pull all this information together to help inform you as you deliberate on the final number for the bond. So with that in mind, I'd like to make sure that you know I've got Dave Hughes and Joel Smallwood in the back. They've been part of the facilities team from the beginning, and if there's some questions that I just can't answer, I'll probably punt over to that corner. And so if that's okay, Chair Kyllo, to have that kind of interaction throughout the night if needed.
That's fine.
That'd be great. We also want to be able to facilitate the conversations for you and track on flip charts and perhaps the whiteboard, so there may be some movement. We have Linda Myers that will be helping as well, because what we want to be able to do as we go through these next few nights with you is to be able to track any clarifying questions that you have, any need for additional information, but also sort of guidance, staff guidance in the making, right? Because in the end, what we'll need is guidance from the board to determine what's in and what's out of the package. Okay? So that's kind of the overview of the process. Let's start with the packet of information, because we've got a bunch here. So the very first, it's formatted very similarly. I won't spend a ton of time on it unless you want to spend more, but the first cover sheet is basically the decision-making process and timeline. Each cover sheet will have an objective, and it will also have supporting documents and information. So the format that you see here will be similar in all of the other informational packets behind it. So the objectives for the entire process is review and verify your decision-making process and timeline. We wanted to utilize a general consensus approach similar to how the board discusses ELs. Seems to flow here, which would be this, or this. And this is yes, and this is perhaps you need more information. And this is maybe there's more discussion as we go through. Okay. And then each of the content areas that you see down in the middle of the page will be presented over the 3 scheduled meetings with staff recommendations to the board at the regular business meeting on December 12th. So essentially, as I'd stated earlier, we'll need your help and guidance in crafting that recommendation for you at the first reading on December 12th for the final bond package. And so we'll also review the information that you see in this order. We're prepared to go over it in this order, where we'll talk about special education classroom at the 6 high school, comprehensive high schools. We'll also, I have this on, is this not working?
No, it went out.
Oh, it went out? Oh. Okay, well, then I don't have to worry about it competing with this then, do I? And this is on, yes it is. Okay, well, we're back in business. So the special education classrooms at the 6 comprehensive high schools, we need to talk about that, and we have Eric here to help us through that conversation. We also have the seismic assessment methodology and approach. Marty was part of a small but effective seismic panel, and we had a discussion. We'll go over that information and be glad if you could share your perspective on that conversation when we get to it as well. And then we have feedback from both the conceptual design reviews that we ran earlier in the process, and then most recently the community listening and learning sessions. And then there are other programmatic considerations that have come up since the last time that we've talked. And so we'll cover all of that. And so then each of the topical areas has its own packet of information. So again, in order, we have the special education, we have the seismic, we have the staff and community feedback, we have land acquisition considerations, and then we have other programmatic considerations. So are there any questions about organization? Yes.
Sharon.
So I do have a question. Starting with the special education, then moving into seismic, those are the 2 areas that we haven't seen the material yet. I'm assuming we're not going to make it through all of these items this evening. Given the bulk of the seismic, I would like us to consider being able to review this before we have this discussion.
Well, yes, and the plan is to walk you through that material tonight.
Okay.
Yeah, but we're not asking for recommendations on seismic at this point.
Okay. It's just nice to be able to read things ahead of time, than to have a quick overview of them.
Got it. Any other questions before we get started, Jesse?
Yeah, so just to confirm, tonight we're just going through the stuff to get the information, and then we're going to talk about it later. Is that right?
A little, yes, and a little of both.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's your meeting. So, I mean, the overview is just as I've given it to you. Here's the content here that we're planning on diving into. The very first area is special education, where we'll go over that material and can have as lengthy of conversations as you need. And same with seismic, which is why we have 3 meetings scheduled, because we can carry that to the next meeting or even the one after that if we need to.
Okay. Sharon, did you have another question? Okay, Jesse, anything else?
Thank you.
Anyone else? Marty?
So when it comes to seismic, I can give you my 60-second, hold on.
Yeah, let's not.
Huh?
You shouldn't have to.
Hello? When it comes to seismic, I can give you my 60-second overview of what I took away from that. Because they went into so many details that really aren't necessary in making our decision.
Okay.
Okay,
Great.
thank you.
Anyone else? Okay. Mike?
All right. So let's go to the special education classroom packet at the high school level. And so the objectives of this conversation are to discuss the special education classroom needs at the 6 comprehensive high schools, and we'll provide an overview of the special education program, external evaluation as it relates to inclusion in neighborhood schools, review the type and location of the specialized classrooms at the high school level, and ask you to verify our approach to addressing the identified needs. And also an objective, this is the guidance in the making. If we can get a sense of importance or priority from the board as we go through, not prematurely, but as it flows through the conversation, then that's kind of what we'll be tracking on the flip charts, so that we can bring that back to you as a board, and you can help us clarify if that's guidance or just really good information.
Okay, I have a question for you. What about Roberts?
Well,
Roberts has no special education. I mean, Roberts, as I look at this, and this is left out of everything. So this is a question for you, not for Eric.
I
But
also
so
noticed.
will Roberts be included somewhere in what it needs and what we need to be doing for Roberts?
Yes.
Okay, because I haven't seen it yet, and I've been through all these meetings, and when I was on the task force, and that was one of the questions that was asked, and I asked, I'm in the book,
Right.
under the South High questions, about what about Roberts, and I still haven't seen anything, so
Okay.
you will be addressing Roberts at some point?
Yes.
Okay, that's my question, so I don't have to get nervous about it now that you're not including it, because you will.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Kathy?
Have we included any other alternative ed areas?
Not in the sense that when we're projecting future enrollment growth, the alternative education programs, we know what the current population is, and we can say that that's pretty static, but those decisions flow throughout the year, in any given year, with a number of circumstances with them. Like, for instance, at the Teen Parent Program, we have a lease with Shemeketa. We're kind of locked in to the number of students that are in that program because of the limited space. So we're not addressing those programs in the same manner as our schools, because we have a population forecast that tells us there will either be more or less students in the next 5, 10, 15, and 20 years. So it's kind of a different approach when you take a look at alt-ed. But the center of the alt-ed is Roberts, and we're dealing with that facility to meet its needs. Also, we're adding science, and I believe we're adding a CTE portion as well. Yep.
Great. Any other questions, Jesse?
Kind of based off of what he was saying, can we get, because you know how we have each individual school, like, it shows exactly what we're doing for each one. Can we get one for Roberts and alternative education for what we're doing for those? And then could we get one for, it'd be cool to see one for science, or for like a few of the big ones that the public really likes, or like C-Tech. It'd be really cool to have like just a packet that we can look at and say, oh, okay, this is what we're doing with these programs.
You mean just a separate document that addresses science, for instance?
Yeah, like one that we could have in this, that's like,
Yeah.
that people, when people look at it, like, hey, what are they doing on science? Boom, it's right there.
Okay.
Or alternative ed, it's right there.
Okay.
Sure.
All right, moving on to special ed.
Okay. So where are we? Here we are. So what we'd like to do is I'd like to turn this over to Eric at this point to kind of guide you through this document, which is the summary of special education program external evaluation, which sets up the rest of the conversation for us, and then I'll guide you through the two remaining documents.
Looks like it wants to stretch too much further, so, good evening, everyone. Oh, can you hear me okay? Okay. I had the opportunity to address you about 2 months ago as part of a strategic plan report where we talked about an external evaluation that had been completed in the district. And so the main focus that I want to bring home again as a reiteration of that report is that there were some concerns found during that evaluation and some recommendations made. And one of the main concerns expressed by the evaluator was that we are over-reliant on restrictive, out-of-the-neighborhood school placements in our district. And to give you a perspective of that at the high school level, 27% of all of our students who receive special education services currently are getting those services away from their neighborhood school. So that's almost 1 in 3 kids in our district. So this is an important equity issue, and one of the most important, or I would call it a cornerstone recommendation that was given to us by the evaluator to include in our short and long-term planning for special education redesign. One of the goals in doing this was to take these recommendations in phases. And so we've worked closely with the facilities folks and committee to come up with an initial phase that addresses needs at the high school level in our comprehensive high schools. And so Mike is going to tell you a little bit about that in a minute. I have provided for you, in addition to the recommendation information, some of the very important reasons why we need to do this, such as preparation for adult living, growth that it affords in the way of opportunities for both our students with disabilities and students without disabilities, more effective use of our resources that we're spending transporting kids all over the district right now, having all of our students be able to accept differences in one another more better as they prepare for adult life, of course supporting civil rights requirements, and then doing a better job of engaging family, because it's not only about the kids when students are placed in other community schools. Some of our families can't get that sense of being a part of a school community as much when they live on one end of town, their child's being bused to service on the other end of town. For some of them, financially, it's difficult to be involved in the life of that school, and just the time involved in transportation to be a part of that community is harder. So Mike, did you want to take?
Well, I think, okay. You're gonna talk too. I got a hot mic. Okay. So one of the other points that I think is really important is when you look at the current situation and the proposed solution on the first page, currently we have 27% of our high school students that receive specialized services not attending their home high school. That's what Eric was referring to when we're talking about transporting students throughout the district. And so part of what we've been doing is how do we address that at the high school level, because we're not able to address it throughout the entire district all at once. So this, as Eric said, this is a phased approach. It was part of the external evaluation recommendation, and so we've woven that into our conversation tonight. And the reason that we need to have it is because when we were going through the task force, the Citizens Facility Task Force, the recommendations, the evaluation was still underway. So we built in the conceptual designs at the high school level the special ed classroom needs in the designs, but we didn't build them into the base bond proposal because we didn't have that information at the time. Okay? So, yes.
Kathy?
I'm sorry, does that mean basically we're outfitting every high school for every need of a special ed student? I mean, what else can you do?
Right. When that's a really good question, because when you look at how the feeder system works, the elementaries feed into the middles, which feed into the high, the entire student population in a feeder system ends up at the high school.
So it seems to me, and maybe you feel differently, but special ed is very personal, needs to be very much attuned to that one person. We have kids that have all kinds of needs and different needs than the regular population. So I wonder if it really is financially the best thing to meet students.
Well, we can talk about that. That's exactly what we need to kind of probe a little bit more. But if you could hold that thought, we'll go into just a little bit more of the detail, and maybe that can help with the conversation. So if you look at this
Jim?
chart,
Well,
yes. Oh, I'm
Jim?
sorry.
So do we know where those 27% of students are going?
Yes.
Where are they going?
Other than their homeschool, you mean?
Yeah, are they going to Roberts? Because if
No.
they're ending up at Roberts, or if they're at another program, that's probably been determined by their IEP team. And I'm just wondering, where are they going? And what's the reason?
We can find that information for you unless you know
Is it a
offhand.
facility issue, or is it a programmatic, educational related issue?
Do you have a
Want me
sense
to
of that?
answer
Yeah.
Sure. Well, let me give you an example. North Salem High School right now does not have a developmental learning center. That's a program for the most cognitively challenged students in our school district. We know right now that we have 31 students grade 9 through 12 who are in a DLC program in another comprehensive high school who really should be going to North Salem High School. So that's 31 kids in the other comprehensive high schools that have a developmental learning center program.
And if you look at the chart, then it would show that there isn't one there.
Correct.
Okay,
What is the X?
Jesse?
sorry.
What does the X2 mean?
So, great transition to the chart. Because if you look at the top, you'll see we're at the current situation, right, of where the locations are, the specialized classrooms. And right behind the chart is this document, which provides the definitions to the abbreviations. So you'll see exactly what those classrooms are intended to do, right? And below that is the proposed solution. So you're asking about the X2. If you look at South DLC, that means South has 2 DLCs currently. But if we continue that conversation and you look below it in the matrix, you'll see in the proposed, they would only need 1.
What's a DHH?
That's a deaf, hard of hearing program. And that's located at Sprague High School.
What did I do with my thing?
Okay.
So, as you see, as you compare from the current classroom locations, the top of the page, to the proposed, you really see that there are adjustments throughout. I mean, McNary doesn't currently have an LSC, but would in the proposal. North doesn't have any DLCs, but would have 2 with an H, which denotes mental or a health model.
One of them would be a health model.
One of them would be a health model. And then I'm going to let Eric talk about the ERCs, why there's different shading from the top and the bottom. And that's directly related to the increase in LRC classrooms you see from current to proposed.
Well, in our district, we provide probably a greater range of classroom options to meet all the needs of students who receive special education services. There are some school districts that simply have 2 types of classrooms. They might call them mild moderate classrooms or moderate severe. We have this full range of classrooms at the high school level that you see here. Specifically with the ERC, that's an even more unique classroom because there is no other district that we are aware of in Oregon who uses those alphabet letters or has this type of a program. So we have 3 right now, and then 3 high schools that don't have that program. But basically, special education is about the provision of services in an individualized education program more than a place, of course, other than being in your neighborhood school. And so we believe that this work group that we have that's working on future planning is going to move in the direction of repurposing what we would now call educational resource centers, which you aren't going to find anywhere else in the state, into LRC classrooms that are more intensive. So in other words, kids wouldn't have to be in an ERC. They would get all of their needs met in an LRC intensive, but they would probably spend more time in pull-out than they would in push-in in that model.
What is pull out and push in?
Jesse?
Push-in is being in a general education classroom at the high school level. That's often co-teaching of the LRC teacher along with the general education teacher in a core subject. And in that classroom, you also have, at times, the special education teacher is doing individual or group work in that classroom as well. Pull-out is where they're not in the general education setting and they're being specifically instructed by the special education teacher, or in this case, the LRC teacher.
Got it. Thank you.
Marty?
So, speaking of the deaf and hard hearing at Sprague, are the students there in the general population and we're providing interpretive services, you know, and they're mainstreaming in, or do these students have additional needs?
Yes, they are largely getting educated in the general education core, but we also have a partnership with Willamette Education Service District because they are regionally eligible. So they get some support services from the ESD, but we have teachers working with them and providing accommodations ranging from FM equipment or whatever their needs might be individually.
Jesse?
Okay. For the DHH, do all the other schools, do they travel to that school if they have kids that?
That's correct.
Okay. And do you know how many kids roughly?
I don't know the exact number, but yeah. It's not a lot. It's a small number.
Okay. Sharon?
Eric, can you tell us a little bit more about the benefit of high school students staying in their home, in their neighborhood school versus being bused or to a school that's not in their neighborhood?
Sure. Well, it's an inherent right they have. When you look at special education law at the federal and state level, the direction that we receive from the federal government is that term that we use called least restrictive environment begins in the neighborhood school. And the neighborhood, that's considered the place where a student would attend if they did not have a disability. So, and then you have the developmental learning center or a placement outside, like in the BIC Center for Behavior, would be a more restrictive placement. It's really important because kids live in that part of town and they associate with people in that part of town. They go to church with them in that part of town and they're in the stores with them in that part of town. And so being able to acquire skills and have an education in that part of town where they live and to be with their peers is good for them. And also it's good for students without disabilities. Because in addition to all the academic needs that kids have, a part of successfully moving into adult life is knowing how to appreciate the differences in the abilities of a full range of kids. And and also they're going to be employers someday who just having that familiarity with one another is important. It's also important for families so that they can be fully engaged in the community, the school community where they live. It's easier for them to do that when it's their neighborhood school that their child is going to.
Kathy?
I still go back to the point that the disability being directly addressed in the absolute best possible way is far more important than where it is.
I completely agree with you.
Okay.
Special education is a service, not a place. Even though it clearly has to be provided at a place, at its core it is a service, individualized.
Mr. Dacopoulos?
I just wanted to add one thing. Federal regulations talk about the least restrictive environment, and then for these higher service programs, the district gets to pick where to put those programs because it recognizes the fact that it may be very difficult to replicate them in each neighborhood school, and so there's this a balancing act between the least restrictive environment, and a good example is the deaf and hard of hearing program. Low incident disability in a feeder system with Willamette ESD. So it would make sense to have that program in each individual school. So the federal regulations give the district some latitude in centralizing some of these programs.
Superintendent Perry?
So I think I know what the answer is to this, but I just want to ask it. In all these programs, we already have kids and the numbers of kids. It's not that we're developing more classrooms to spread the kids out in even lower class sizes. We're saying a DLC, North is the example, we already have 31 kids, and we believe that they ought to have a classroom there at their site. Different than we're not putting a deaf and hard of hearing program everywhere because we don't have the numbers. So we have the numbers of students to fill these classrooms already. They just happen to not be filled at their home high schools.
That's correct.
Is that accurate? Okay.
Yeah, or another, you gave the example of DLC, same with life skills. Like right now, if you're from the McNary feeder area and you need services in a life skills classroom, you can't get that there in that high school because we don't have that classroom available in the continuum of services in that particular high school.
So then we would bus
Kathy?
that child.
Correct.
I'm sorry, I keep
That's fine,
forgetting.
Kathy. It's your turn.
I just finished.
I didn't hear it, so could you repeat it?
Yeah, I said, I assume that means we'll bus that child.
That's accurate.
Okay.
Jesse?
In the a student who's in the LRC program, I was just wanting to make sure. What are we doing to make sure that that there's less pressure on the teachers because they already have to manage a whole classroom full of kids? Is there like a student aid or something that helps the kids who are in the classroom?
Yes. There are instructional assistants that help with instructional things. Some of our kids, not typically as much in an LRC classroom, but we're seeing that more because of behaviors in our schools now, might have adult assistance of some kind, like if they have a behavior plan that has to be implemented.
And are they trained for helping
Yes.
with kids?
They all go through training.
Okay, awesome.
Okay. Sharon, did I see your hand?
You did, and I forgot.
Okay. Kathy?
Back basically to what Jesse said, is that disruptive having an aid with that one particular child or two, or some inside instruction going on in the classroom while all the others are doing something different?
No, actually, it's meant to create an environment that's more conducive for learning for that child and also for the other children in that classroom by having the adult assistance available for support.
Anyone else? Chuck?
I probably missed this, but could you explain how the post-bond affects the $620 million dollar sign that we're looking at? I mean,
Yes.
My question was how many classrooms will we be adding, so I think they're related.
All right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what's the bottom line here? Okay, I like what I'm hearing, but how
Okay.
does this decision affect what we're talking about?
Well, this gets to where I get to flip chart a little bit, which is every one of these has a staff recommendation associated with it, but it's a draft recommendation, obviously. So, and part of the process is to deliberate the staff recommendation and help give us the guidance that we need to perhaps change that recommendation. So, having said all that, the special ed.
Mike, you need to move your chart pack because Eric is right, there we go, is right square in the,
Does that work?
it's better.
Everybody see it? What is this color? Pink? Probably not the best.
Probably not.
20 million.
20 million.
And so as we continue to go through, can you hear me now? I don't know. Yeah. As we continue to go through this,
Marty?
In addition to the 619, this is an additional 20 million.
yes, this is not built into the base bond package. So what we'll need as we go through each of these content areas, we will ultimately need guidance from you that allows us to determine, is 620 the ceiling, the max? So if 20 million is coming in, then 20 million needs to come out. Or is there another number above 620 at some point that you would like to discuss? And so we're not there tonight. That's not what we're here for, but we're leading towards that. And so I'm glad you asked the question up front, because that's ultimately where we end up.
And could you remind me why that wasn't included in the 620?
Yes, because at the time that we went through the Citizens Facility Task Force and then the base bond proposal that we presented, the external evaluation of the program was still underway, and they hadn't reached the conclusions that we're dealing with now.
Okay.
So the information just wasn't there. But once we received it, we built those classroom spaces into the conceptual designs so that they would fit at the site, but we couldn't, because we hadn't had this conversation about what to do with the 20 million.
Okay, Jim?
So I guess my question is, as I read this, it says the first phase centers on creating a full range of specialized program in each of our comprehensive high schools. I'm assuming then we will have other phases in the future that will deal with other entities, and why is the recommendation high schools versus elementary schools versus middle schools?
Yeah, Eric.
Well, there are a smaller number of high schools, for one thing, and the continuum of services at the high school level is easier as a first phase to close in, with the addition of a DLC where it's not currently a life skills, and then expanding the LRCs as needed.
Because I'm going to assume if we've got 27% of our high school students that aren't attending their neighborhood school, we've got a larger number of elementary kids that aren't attending their neighborhood school.
Well,
and potentially a larger number of middle school students, just looking at the population of our district, not attending their neighborhood school.
Eric?
I could get the specific numbers, but our total district numbers are 21% of our students in special education are placed outside of their neighborhood school. At the high school level, the percentage is higher, and we have about 1,925 kids receiving special education at high school level, about 525 of those who are placed outside of their neighborhood school.
Okay, Jesse?
Is this 20 million and everything that we've been talking about, is this all just for high school special education programs?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay, do we have any plans, or are we talking about middle school or elementary school?
We have work groups that have taken these recommendations, and they're working on short and a long-range plan, which is on the strategic plan. Mm-hmm. And, it's a little harder to do at the elementary level because we have 44 schools. But, for example, one of the goals may end up being the initial step would be that where we don't have enough programs in a feeder area, if we can't immediately get all kids back to their neighborhood school, that we at least have something available in their feeder area where their neighborhood is located for them to be able to be closer to where they live.
Okay, Chuck?
Eric, how do we know that the quality of education that they're going to get in their neighboring school is going to be better than the quality of education they're getting right now?
Well, as far as...
I heard you talk about the importance of them being in the community and everything else, but I guess my question, I'll just restate it again, is the quality of education they're going to get in the neighboring school better than what they're getting right now?
I believe it will be in a comprehensive sense. As far as instruction goes, we have teachers that graduate, we hire out of college who are trained to meet the needs of any type of student in special education services. They all receive the same type of professional development and supervision throughout the district. So we would like to believe that no matter where a student goes, they're going to get good instruction in special education services. But it's more than just that. It's also the opportunity to be educated alongside peers who live in the neighborhood with them, both for their sake and for the sake of the kids without disabilities, that rounds out the full educational experience and prepares them for successful transition into adult life.
Okay, Kathy, I believe, had her hand up. Yes, no, and then
Yes,
Jesse, and then
so
Sharon.
I guess to Paul particularly, so least restrictive district, do we have any choice, or is that an absolute federal mandate, whether we move kids into another feeder area, or whether they stay in their neighborhood, or whether we handle them the way we are now?
Well, the least restrictive environment is the black letter law. So that's the starting point. When you get into the alphabet programs that serve specialized needs, you get to decide where that's located. And we have a lot of success on those kinds of arguments. When we get involved in conflict over where a student attends a program. And so the federal regulations give us a lot of control over where we put a program. There are nuances to this that apply to individual students. For example, if there's a series of case law that says even if a kid is placed in a program, if the child has a bad experience in that program, the parents can essentially claim that the child's experience has been poisoned through no fault of anyone's, really. It's not a good fit. And so in that sense, the parents can argue that the student needs to be in another program at another location. And we have those issues that come up. And so that's an exception to the exception. And so we do have those individualized decisions that we get to make. And I can't think of any other examples readily, but I think in summary, you have a black letter law that kids should be educated in the least restrictive environment. If they're going to be in a pull-out program, we get to say where that program is. And then there will be occasions when we might have to move a student to another program because the program's not working.
Okay.
I think that's as simple as I can make it.
Kathy, did that answer your question?
Well, yes and no. It makes me wonder why for 20-some, 30 years, least restrictive area wasn't quite that way. I mean, we particularly in the elementary education, kids weren't necessarily, the consideration wasn't the neighborhood school. Consideration was the proper program.
Well, I mean, the way the federal regulations are written, I mean, they come right out and say the least restrictive environment is a neighborhood school. And the school district has to consider that. The IEP team has to consider that as a first option. And on all the placement pages on an IEP that's attached to an IEP, a school team will list the neighborhood school with no pull-out services as on this, the idea is on this continuum. And that will always be considered in an initial placement. Now, if a student has been in special education for years and years and has never been at their neighborhood school, the IEP team isn't going to talk about, well, what about sending the kid back to their neighborhood school? But in an initial placement situation, this is always going to be the conversation, and the federal regulations actually say the neighborhood school is the least restrictive environment. And the next step is neighborhood school with a certain amount of pull-out. which is now measured by a percentage, you know, less than 40%, greater than 40%, greater than 70%. And these are all highly regulated by the Oregon Department of Education, all these percentages. So if a student isn't going to be in their neighborhood school because they have to be in a program that's specialized like one of these we're talking about, then we're way past neighborhood school conversation. We're now talking about how much services in one of these programs with pull-out services into the regular classroom at this new school. But neighborhood schools have always been considered, under federal regulations, the least restrictive.
You did make me feel better when you said if a child hasn't been in a neighborhood school and we hadn't had it for a number of years, we aren't suddenly going to go that route.
Well, what Eric is saying and holds so true, and that is that when we talk about the specialized needs, we're not talking location, we're talking services. So if an IEP team were all of a sudden to decide that a student no longer needed more specialized services, then I think the IEP team would be talking about a return to the neighborhood school, and this does happen.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes the option to even receive a certain kind of specialized service hasn't been there because that program hasn't been offered at the neighborhood school. And sometimes these classrooms have been placed where they are because there was space in the building rather than strategically looking at the feeder area and making sure a certain number of those programs were in each area. So we're trying to address that through this evaluation and a short and long range plan.
Okay, Jesse.
Well, what makes me uncomfortable with this conversation is that, like, as we're talking about this about high schools, we're putting these kids through elementary school and then middle school, then finally once they get to high school, once we actually go through with this, and then we're going to be finally having a really good program. And so I think that we're really, because we have like one shot to give these kids a really good education to set them up for the future. And just like with kids, like when you're teaching them right from wrong, when you're teaching them how to learn, how to grow and be successful, we only get one shot at that. And so I think we should have a conversation about middle schools and elementary schools, just do it all at once. I mean, I know it's a lot of work, but I know it's also it's important, and I think it's imperative that we do that because if we only fix just high schools to begin with, okay, well, what about the middle schools and elementary schools? I think that if we're going to do this, we need to do it really well rather than just one small piece.
Okay. Sharon?
Thank you. So going back, so that there's not maybe the misconception that we're talking about moving lots and lots of children in high school. Again, it would be adding a class to North, or two classrooms to North, adding another classroom to McKay, and then shifting the ERC work to additional LRC rooms.
Yes, there's a combination of things going on this chart. There are new classrooms that would be a part of the bond, which are the addition of a DLC at North, the addition of a life skills at McNary, and then there are 13 LRC classrooms that would need to be added.
Right.
But what this also allows us to do is that we know, for example, right now, the largest number of kids who are not attending their neighborhood school and special ed in high school are from the McKay and the North Salem areas. And so right now we have 2 DLCs at West that really, that's not the best location for them. They only need one there. We are able to move one of those classrooms to McKay to go with the one that they have there to get more kids back there. And then we are able to move the medical model DLC from McNary, which is a long bus ride for a lot of kids, to the North Salem high school to go along with the new DLC put in there as well for kids with high medical needs that is centrally located for transportation purposes and because more kids are from that particular neighborhood area as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Jim?
So, Mike, I just have a clarifying question, because I want to make sure I got this right. To do all this for the high schools would cost an additional $20 million?
Yes.
So when I look at the sheets here for McKay and for North and McNary, where we say we're adding several new special education rooms, that's in addition to what's on these sheets?
No. No, the profile sheets are as accurate as they could be, and so are the conceptual designs. What we're catching up with is the cost of doing that.
So again, I need clarification of my question. Is it truly $20 million in addition to do all this stuff, or is some of this figured in? Like in McKay, we've got several new special education rooms in the profile. McNary has that, North has that. I mean, are we talking more than what's in the profile?
No.
Okay.
But doesn't the profile mean the 620 million?
No, that's the point that I led with earlier. Go ahead.
Okay.
We updated the conceptual designs. We crafted the conceptual designs to include the classroom space once we received the information from the external evaluation of the program. So again, this is one of those dynamic conversations as we move through the process. When we have more updated information, we try to use it as much as possible.
So did we use those in our listening sessions?
Yes.
Updated?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. My question earlier was, how many classrooms is this additional? And I think I heard Eric say 15.
Correct.
As he was listing them off. So
The-
that's okay.
there-
I just wanted to make sure I heard that correctly.
There's 15 LRCs, there's 6 DLCs,
Okay, 21,
there's 1 EGC,
22,
there's 2 life skills,
24.
and then we have office space for staff built into the 20 million, which they don't currently have. So we have teachers with no office space that they will now have office space as a teaching station.
At the various schools, space that they currently don't have, so
Yes.
that means additional space.
That's right, and the total is close to 40,000 square feet of additional space built in at the 6 high schools.
Okay,
That's the 20 million.
okay. Marty?
So is it more important for the students to be at their home high school, or is it more important to be in the same feeder system for their entire education? So they have the same peers that they're growing up with. You know, if they grew up with kids at Washington Elementary and then went to Waldo, but really, you know, they're from North and now they're at North. They are maybe with people in their neighborhood, but they are not with their peers that they grew up with during their education.
Would you like me to?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, ideally, neighborhood school is the less restrictive. If the particular kind of service that is needed is not available there, the next best thing would be to be able to limit the time of transportation. We've got kids spending long periods of time on buses now, which makes them more tired and when they get to school, less prepared to learn. So to reduce the amount of travel time and to keep it as close to their neighborhood, if it can't be in their school, in that feeder area, would be the next best thing to the neighborhood school.
Okay. Jesse, then Chuck?
Sure. I have just 2 really quick questions. The first one is, since we're having a bond coming up and we're bringing up extra dollar amounts, are we going to be expressing to the public that, hey, the dollar amount may change, or like, hey, this is how the cost of this? Because when we were doing all of the meetings with these, we mentioned special education, but with that, it gives the perception that that's included with the 620 million.
Yeah, and we
So-
need to be careful about that.
Yeah, and so I don't want us to be like, oh, hey, just kidding, public, we need more money. And then also, I think, when are we going to be talking about, is there a time frame for when we're going to talk about middle school and elementary school and what the cost would be?
For the special education, I don't know that we've finished the analysis, have we?
Well, the evaluation addresses elementary, middle, and high school. So we're working on things that improve the quality of instruction, the full educational experience for kids regardless of the level that they're in. That's an ongoing work that we're doing in the strategic plan. It's just the facilities piece at the middle and the elementary level that we haven't gone into like we are doing with the high school right now.
So how long do you think until we'd have like a middle school and elementary school of one of these packets? Like something to look at, like a plan?
Well, we're going to have a short and longer term plan accomplished by the end of this school year.
Okay, awesome.
For the recommendations.
All right, thank you, Eric.
Okay, Christy?
So I want to go back to the real question about the 620 million. We're not in any, don't have this preconceived notion that we're just adding on. We know that most likely one of the things you're going to say to us is, here's the number, and even though you might say, yeah, that special ed's really a high priority for us, can you come back with a recommendation that takes something out to get to whatever that is? So while we're stacking on numbers here tonight, we're not expecting that it's just going to keep increasing. We're expecting you to say, here's where we think you need to be. Now come back and tell us, can you prioritize special ed and still get it X number? So.
Got it, awesome, thank you.
Okay. Mr. Lee, then Sharon.
That kind of answers my question. I was going, so now are we looking at 640 million instead of 620? So that kind of answers that question. The other question I've got, though, is how does this affect the general fund? I mean, we're, you know, as far as extra personnel and everything else, is this going to be, have we done any analysis if we do this, what the effect is going to be on our budget for next year?
Well, so I can jump in on that. None of this happens in 1 year. This is over a 3 to 5 year period, which would be the life of the bond. So you can look at the schools and where they're scheduled. Like, for instance, McNary and North would be the first two. So that's where any budget impact would hit in 1 year. And then the next year there would be another 1 or 2, and then the next year after that.
So here's the question, does 22 FTE, or does 22 classrooms equal 22 more FTE?
No, it does not.
Okay.
If I can give you an example.
24.
If you look at the chart for LRCs, for example, you see 3 listed for McKay and McNary currently, and you see 7. Now, that's not FTE. That's the number of classrooms right now. What you don't see there is that we currently have 6 LRC teachers, 6 FTE at McKay and at McNary, but they're having to share rooms, which is a problem at times. So if you look into the future with the bond completed, let's take McKay and McNary. You may see a total of 8 additional classrooms between those 2 schools in the LRC, but that's only 2 FTE because you already have 6 at each of the schools.
Sharon, then Kathy. I'm sorry, go ahead. Chuck first.
And I get that, but I think that when we're starting to look at scenarios like this, we need to keep in mind, too, the expense to the general fund. We've got a ballot measure coming up in January that could have a big impact on our budget. And so it's more than just the bond sometimes. It's the FTEs that go with decisions like this, too. So I'd just like us to keep that in mind.
Okay, anything else?
No.
Okay, I don't want to cut you off again.
But you're so good at it.
I know, I try. Sharon?
So first, I do appreciate, Chuck, I appreciate that comment, but, you know, our goal and our requirement is to address the needs of students in our community, and, you know, we're all supposed to be advocates to the legislature and whomever else we can message to about the actual needs of education. So I'm hesitant to say, well, let's not do what we know we need to do because, you know, the funding may not come through from the legislature, but I do appreciate that comment. That's point well taken. Back to, though, the comment about are we messaging to the public more, we haven't set an amount. So, you know, between now and when we set the amount, we need to be careful that we're not saying we set an amount at 620, now we're adding, because we haven't done that. So we just want to be careful that, you know, when we're out talking about this, that we're not saying a particular, we've already set and decided and voted on. We don't want that to come across that we've set, because, yeah, you're right, the public's not going to appreciate the perception that we're adding on.
Kathy?
Well, a couple of things. We say, well, this isn't going to be all in 1 year. It's going to be in 3 to 5 years. Well, the forecast for the position we'll be in for the next 3 to 5 years is not good. I mean, unless we get some magic wand from the legislature, we still have increasing PERS coming up, and we're having to let go of teachers versus hire more. And that's one of the biggest concerns I had about the whole bond, and frankly, I still have them. And whenever we refer to anything, we never seem to refer to what if we can limit that bond amount. We always talk about, can we add more? And I'm definitely on the side of seeing us limit it more. And frankly, you gave us the number of 40,000 square feet that we were adding. And for $20 million, comes in at $500 a square foot, which is a lot of money per square foot. And I realize that there's various construction and you have to find places for them and all kinds of things, but that's more than what some of the most expensive houses I've seen in Salem ever built at $500 a foot. And it's more than major buildings that we have in Salem. And none of those have hit $500 a foot that I'm aware of, and a lot of those are with medical facilities in them. So we aren't talking about cheap, inexpensively doing this.
I address that? You're right, and those houses and those medical facilities aren't built over a 3 to 5 year period with the annual escalation. So this is a total number for that square foot based on the escalation year by year as well.
Okay. I know. I'm watching the clock as well, but somebody keeps asking questions, Jesse.
I have another question.
I knew that. I saw that.
Well, I did want to clarify also, because I work at a bank, right? And so one thing that's pretty common with people, when you see a number and you're told something, in your head, you automatically associate that with a number. And so just to clarify, I think it's important that when we're sending out messaging, even though that's technically not what we said, we don't want to give the perception to people that this is what it is. We want to make sure that it's 100% clear, just because we did have board members also asking questions about this. So I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we keep the public on the same page. And then also, I do agree, I like Chuck's comment about making sure that the general fund is also kept in mind as we're going over all these options, just because the bond's awesome and it's good for us to be financially responsible with that, but not at the expense of ruining the general fund and also taking care of the kids. And then my question is, the designs, you know how we've been going over designs for new construction?
Right.
Were these in the designs that we saw?
Yes.
Or are we going to, okay, they are?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. With that, this ending of that question, we will take a 5-minute break. Thank you. So,
the history, basically go over the material, not in as much detail unless you want to, that the seismic review panel went through. So you have the panel presentation outline that I've highlighted some key areas that I'll talk through. You've got a process summary sheet, a couple sheets behind there. You have the overall summary with actually has numbers to it. And then you have the full seismic study from our engineering firm as well, which has all of the information in it, in addition to what we're going over. So let's start with basically, we review the objectives here. We want to briefly review the history of the seismic risk and building code evolution in Oregon. That will be stimulating conversation. Review the district seismic needs assessment methodology and overall approach to addressing the identified needs. The panel actually verified our approach and made some suggestions, at least as far as presenting the material, and we can talk about that a little bit as well. And again, guidance in the making to staff as we go through this. So let's start with the overall history of why this is an issue in this state. I can tell you that there are many, many structures that are built in this state, and in particular in our district, that were built before we had the awareness of how big of an issue the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake could be. And so, having said that, interestingly enough, that the last major earthquake was in 1700. And so, by all experts' assessment, we are within the zone of probability as we speak for the next major one. Am I missing anything, Marty, on that one? Yeah. So this is a real and present issue for the district to attend to. Section B under number 1, the history, is really just how the code, the building code, and the recognition of the risk has evolved from all the way from 1973 to 1977. You can see how throughout the years, when we've become more aware of the issues and the risks, the code has evolved and modified to attend to it. And back in 2005, the Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, DGAMI, created an assessment process. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into the process summary conversation. But essentially, it was a massive scope. It was a huge undertaking, and it was part of Senate Bill 2, and generated a report to the 74th Legislative Assembly. Essentially, DGAMI had to, in the end, assess for seismicity purposes over 3,300 buildings throughout the state. And so that's what we call the drive-by or the walk-by assessment that DGAMI did in 2005, okay? We'll talk a little bit more about that, but part of that process is the rapid visual screening process. It's fast and efficient. It can take as little as 15 minutes or as long as 75, but it is not an engineering analysis. It essentially, I mean, the only way you're going to get through over 3,300 buildings is to have some process that you could rapidly assess the risks of collapse. And so what you have here, and you can look at some of the key parameters, you take a look at the seismic level, the soil type, the building age, the building type, and such. And essentially what we end up with, and I'm going to draw a little bit here, what we end up with is the rapid visual screening process is a FEMA. It's a federal process. Oregon organized it and enhanced it, which turned it into the ERVS. And that's where you get the very high, moderate, and low risk structures. Okay? That's where that language comes from. And so what you end up with is, let's say you have 100 buildings. You do this drive-by or this walk-by with checklists, right? And you know what the soil type is, you know what the construction type of the building is, and you quickly put those buildings in buckets. That's either very high risk, that's high, that's moderate, or that's low, okay? What that allows you to do is focus your resources. Right? You don't know until you get in and start doing some engineering assessments, which is the next phase, right? RVS is just a screening phase. You have to actually hire some engineers and conduct what we call Tier 1 and Tier 2 assessments and evaluations. And the difference between a Tier 1 and a Tier 2 is just more time and energy and more detailed engineering assessments, okay? Now, there's two languages here. There's the FEMA language, right? That'll get you the very high. And then there's the engineering language. I'm just going to put the acronyms here, and it's on the second page. It's the ASCE 41, and that stands for the American Society of Civil Engineers. So you move from a very high-level assessment screening process to a very detailed engineering assessment, right? And what you end up with at the end of this is a list of deficiencies. Okay? It's no longer just, is it a very high-risk structure? You've actually gone in and you've identified exactly what the structures in each of the areas need to be fixed. So for instance, if you go to the last page of this overview, there's an example that we're using, and it's Waldo. Okay? Now believe me, this content, well, it seems like I may be moving fast. Marty, I think we spent maybe a half hour on this, right? And the feedback we got from the panel was, don't spend a half hour on, on this part. So we're trying to adjust accordingly.
Marty, did you want to comment now?
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh.
On life safety, I think this is something I've never quite gotten to. What is that in terms of minutes? So a 9.0 Cascadia event is approximately 5 minutes of shaking. Very high, we know that that's probably going to come down, but when? Is it after a minute? Would it last 5 minutes and then it's going to come down? I mean, what kind of time for the different levels do those people have to get out? Because they're not going to get out right when it's shaking. It's going to be shaking too hard.
Right, and I'm going to go back and forth with Joel, but if you could speak into the mic, Joel.
Yeah. So the very high, for instance, is directly around the likelihood of collapse in any major event, a 9.0 as you mentioned. So it's not based on a duration of it. If we have that kind of an event and it's expected to last several minutes, that's where it gets to the very high. So there's not really a time frame associated with it.
So there's no way to estimate that it's very high, but it will probably stand for 10 minutes after the shaking started, giving people time to get out. There's no way to kind of estimate what that might be. So it could fall in 30 seconds.
Yeah, it could. There is nothing in either of these evaluation processes that would give you a time, and I'm not aware of one existing, an evaluation process that would give you that. Could it be estimated? Yes, but it would be one engineer's opinion versus another engineer's opinion. There's nothing in code or anything that I'm aware of that would allow you to estimate that.
Okay.
Yeah, great question.
Mike?
Still me? Okay. And so basically what we have through this process is a list of specific deficiencies by structure, which is the Waldo example. So when you look at the Waldo example, A through E, is everyone with me? What you see here are the basic structures here. There are 5 separate structures that make up Waldo School, middle school. And you can see that the original classrooms, and you can see that that's a 66,622 square foot building structure built in 1956, is very high. Okay, but the rest of the structures are either high or moderate. All right, and the evaluation with our engineers takes us from here with the MSC, I'm sorry. We just changed their corporate structure. Engineers, you have what's called the life safety performance level. When we build schools, we build them to the current code. Now remember, there's a difference between building a new school and retrofitting an existing structure. Building code tells you how to build a new school. When we build a new school, we build it to the life safety performance standard, which is you should be able to get out with nothing falling on your head. Okay? because there's structural and non-structural components. The non-structural components are what you see above you and what's above the ceiling, essentially, right? There's lots of others, but just as an example. In a new building, everything would stay intact and you would be able to get out, okay? Now, the difference between the full life safety performance standard when you go into retrofit, okay, you have to take into account the structural and the non-structural. That's a huge cost when you go back in to retrofit an existing structure, okay? So take our 4 most at-risk structures that we've addressed over the years. That would be the McKinley, the Highland, the Englewood, and the Richmond, right? Those were all unreinforced masonry construction, some of the highest risk. Plus, I think they're all 100 years old or close to it. Obviously not built with the 9.0 in mind. So the full life safety performance level to retrofit would have required us to strap the building so that none of the bricks would fall off, to go in and wire the ceilings so nothing would fall, and we wouldn't have enough money to do even one school. So the district has had a philosophy over the years, and we've worked with MCS engineers to develop that, and some of the recommendations from the engineers and the panel validated this approach by the district, is to focus on egress only. And what that means is safe exiting. Okay? So, for instance, at Englewood or Highland or Richmond or McKinley, if you've been to any of those schools, you've seen sort of the metal frame that we built into those schools. That's so that the floors don't pancake. Okay? We've also created hardened overhangs, so when you exit, any debris that's falling off of the building won't hit you. Okay? That's egress only. It's not the full life safety retrofit standard of structural and non-structural. Okay? And some of the questions that I would ask if I were you is, why did the district choose to go down that path? Part of the reasoning that we've used as a district is the prudent use of resources, very limited resources. And so we believe that there's the enormity of the needs around seismic would not allow us to address any one school adequately if we went to the full life safety standard and spent the money making sure ceiling tiles didn't fall. So we focused our energy and our resources on, with our engineering firm, on developing an egress only or safe exit approach. So we were able to take the money and address 4 schools instead of 1 with that type of approach. So when we get into more of the detail, and I'll show you that in the report in just a second, but to stay on the Waldo piece, you see the various cost estimates. You have the estimated retrofit cost, which would be the full life safety to the structural standard. Even on the estimated retro, it's not non-structural, is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. And then right next to it is the egress only estimated retro cost. So you can see there's a cost differential by focusing only on the egress only safe exit approach. I'd like to pause and see if there's any questions, because that's a lot of information.
Jesse?
Okay, so I have 2 questions. The first is retrofit. I just wanted like a clear definition of what that means. Is that like the school's reusable, or does that mean it's just not going to fall on your heads?
Safe egress. You can get out safe, but you don't go back in.
Okay, but that's what retrofit is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, even if it was the full structural and non-structural life safety standard for retrofit, that's just to get out safely,
Got it.
not to reoccupy.
Okay, awesome. And then I was wondering, when we're doing this, I mean, I'm sure you guys have probably thought of this, but when we're looking at some of like our old schools that have been around for like 100 years, are we spending a lot of, how are we allocating what schools we're going to spend the money on fixing? Because, for example, if it's a building made of bricks made in like the 1800s, it's probably going to collapse eventually, and we're going to have to rebuild a new one anyways. But of course, we want the kids to be safe and get out. But are we making sure that we're choosing schools that we're not going to have to rebuild eventually anyways? Or
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a funny thing in K-12. When you build a school, it never goes away. I mean, these schools are 100 years old. But we focused on, with the limited resources that we currently had with the 2008 bond, we focused on the 4 highest risk schools, which were those 100-year-old schools.
okay.
Exactly. And then as we get into more of the detail of the report, you'll see school by school exactly what structures are very high, moderate, or low. Yeah, and so, for instance, we'll get into this in just a second, but North has 11 separate structures. All of our schools have multiple structures, except for the brand new ones. They're one structure.
Okay. Kathy?
Yeah, Mike, the 4, the McKinley, Highland, Richmond, and Inglewood.
Yeah.
Are they done to what standard?
They're done to the egress only safe
Okay.
exit.
But all done, we don't have to go back and,
Well,
or,
the schools proper are, but at McKinley, and I'll let Joel speak to that one, there's a structure that isn't the main school.
Those 4 retrofit projects dealt with the 3-story portion of those buildings. That was the unreinforced masonry portion of those structures that was the highest risk at that site. There are still high risk at, especially like McKinley. There are other areas that still remain on this list.
okay.
So it was the highest of the highest, if you will.
Gesundheit,
Thank
Mr. DeCopoulos. Anyone else? I have a question. If no one, Chuck? Oh, Jim? Sharon? In the planning, and this may be coming up, which would be fine, are we putting in extra rooms as well for storage of water and clothes and
No,
things like that?
we're not.
We're not, so.
We're not creating emergency shelters. We're creating
Okay.
safe exit,
Okay,
egress only.
yeah, okay, I want to make sure.
And even, it's a great question, even in the new construction, when we've talked about enhancing our design standard to immediate reoccupancy, that isn't immediate reoccupancy, and now the district is an emergency management function. We're not creating the costs associated with generators and water and food. The structures, though, will be available to those agencies that do that.
Okay. Just making sure. Okay.
Okay? And so you see how the example of Waldo's used, and I'm about ready to dive into the main report for you. So you can see all of the detail. So if you take the seismic study 2017, which is the big report, the first view is the background and the difference between, we've already covered this, which is the seismic evaluation RVS, and then the Tier 1, Tier 2. And then if you fast forward to page, the unnumbered pages that start to look like this, okay, about 5 in, page 7. The first thing you see is the overall summary table, where if you take the red A column and you go all the way down to the bottom, you'll see that we had originally estimated the very high for the task force purposes at 56 million, and that 56 million is in the 620 or 619. You can see that the construction cost is almost 41 million, but you have to add the soft cost and contingency as well to that. So while we initially estimated 56 million, after all of the engineering verification of every one of those structures, we're coming in at 57 million. So we were pretty darn close way back when we started the conversations with the task force. Now, the question is, if you're going, here comes the money. Here comes the money part. there are great efficiencies from a construction project standpoint if you're already going into a site to address the very high, and there are high structures rated high there as well. If you didn't have to worry about resources and you didn't have to worry about money, you'd fix the highs as well, okay? But we do have to worry about resources, and we do have to worry about money. So let's take Waldo as our example, and if you look at the overall summary sheet here, and you move from left to right, you can see that the very high egress only is $948,000. The very high full life safety structural is almost 1.3 million. So you can see that there's a savings right there. The high life safety is 1.4 million. So if we were going into Waldo to deal with the very high and also the high, the total cost there, I'm sorry, you'd have to add another 1.4 million to the 950. You see? And so to answer the question that I'm sure will come up, how much would it cost to address the high structures as well? If you go all the way down to column C, you can see that the high life safety, and we can reduce this a bit. We didn't ask our engineers to come up with the egress only life safety. So it would be less than this, but the most conservative number would tell us that that's another 92 million. We wanted to deal with all of the high structures. It would be less than 92, but the highest end would be 92 million. So then, if the board was interested in providing guidance to staff on what a recommendation might look like, if you can't do all of the high, maybe there are some you could do, right? Maybe there are some, and maybe there are some parameters that we could talk about, maybe not tonight, but some parameters that could say, think about the high structures as well if that cost doesn't exceed 50% of the very high. Or maybe a range, if between 75 and 50% of the very high, to see what that number might look like. And I would say, this is the summary sheet pretty much says it all, but if you flip over and you see the breakout of every school in every feeder system, and if you have any questions about any of the schools, all of the data is included in this report. So you can look at McKay. McKay's not on the list because it's all rated high. Yeah.
So as I look at your summary chart.
Yeah.
So Roberts isn't going to fall down?
No.
Okay, just wanted to check.
Are they finishing that up?
They're still working on that in Valley.
It's what?
Yeah.
Yeah. Not that new. How new is Roberts?
Let me rewind that a little bit.
Uh-huh.
The dashes here,
Uh-huh.
I thought they were supposed to have this done. Yeah. What's that?
It's just not on the summary.
Didn't roll to the
It
summary.
didn't roll to the summary.
Okay.
Okay. Very back. It's low.
It's the last page.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, so I go with my first answer. Yes.
Okay.
And I'm assuming then, Mike, if I may, Paul,
You may, Jim.
this assumes, because I'm looking at all the stuff that's in these buildings, they didn't look at our portables,
No. They did not look at our portables.
because we got a lot of kids in portables, which some were built prior to our current code,
Yeah, and
and they're not sitting on, you know, the best foundations in all instances, so
Right.
we've got even a worse problem if you take into account our portables.
I agree. I agree. Now, the other thing I would say is, without getting into too much engineering on this, at least they're built out of material that is better suited
Sure.
to deal with. They're not brick and mortar. They're not, oh, and by the way, I have a, just so you know, I brought a visual aid. Some of this is called a clay tile. This is what you find in the walls of McNary and other schools that were built during that period, seismically, horrible. That's what makes them high risk. Walls will move with this. It was put in place because at the time, the building codes moved away from asbestos as a fire retardant. This is great as a fire retardant, has absolutely no seismicity strength to it whatsoever. So that's what drives some of these numbers when you take a look at a McNary, for instance, why it would cost so much to deal with the high ratings there. There, I finally got to use it.
Got it. Yeah, there you go.
Already. It's very high.
Which one?
McNary.
Sure, Kyle.
Yes, I'm sorry, Sharon.
Quick question. What percentage of our portables, though, are we talking about removing through this process?
Yeah, I think we're looking at about the 60% when it's all said and done.
About
The older ones.
Yep.
Yeah, the older ones, about 60%. The way the portables are constructed, single story, fairly standard construction, wood construction, just in general, they aren't going to reach that very high, even the old ones. They would probably at most hit a moderate level on this. That we'd have to run that through our engineer,
Well,
but
it
just,
depends on where they sit next to a building that could have bricks falling off of it.
well,
That's a good
yeah,
point.
yeah, but, yeah.
And the
that's true.
foundation we put those portables on.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sharon, did that answer your question? Okay. Anyone else? Yeah. Chuck?
So basically, in the 620 million figure, we've got A only.
We've got A only, yes.
Okay. And so if we were to go to B and C, it would increase it by another 100 million, 115 million, something like that. Is that correct?
Yeah, but B replaces A. That number replaces A because A is the district's standard around egress only.
So we'd be looking at, I'm just looking at B plus C, total school cost, bottom line
Yep.
161. Okay.
Yep.
So it'd only be raising by about 100, right?
Yeah, you'd have to just take 56 million out of that number, and you'd be right at close to what you were talking about.
So,
57.
yeah, that's, how, I mean, for example,
It's these two. Here's the 160.
hate to bring this up, Paul, but, you know, as a school board, based on these figures and things, if we decide not to go to B plus C, and we have a major earthquake, what's the legal liability that the school district would encounter? I mean, is that a fair question that we need to be thinking about as far as liability? I guess the other question I would have is, what kind of credibility does this engineering firm have for us to be basing these decisions on this? Was there a couple of companies that, you know, were asked to submit figures? Is that, I mean, it's one thing to have one company come in and say this is what it is, but is there a second opinion sought at all on any of this? And
No, not on this work. And one of the reasons is that MCS has been working with the district on the seismic issues for a number of years. And so they're also working at the statewide level. Doug, one of the principals, is very respected in the industry. We can bring them in, and you can have a face-to-face with them on Thursday if you'd like, because it's a very good question. The district has been relying on their expertise, and as a registered professional engineer, it's your livelihood and your profession when you stamp those plans.
yeah.
Yeah.
You had a liability question, and yes, I know you're in line. But Chuck had a liability question for Paul that Paul didn't answer yet.
So on the question of liability for how a school board or any governmental entity would spend, limited resources, you have defense of discretionary immunity on a claim that would result in injury. So how you choose to spend district money on retrofitting buildings would be subject to a discretionary immunity defense. If someone were to get hurt on, for example, in a high area that you decided not to spend money on, not that you wouldn't be sued, because anyone can bring a lawsuit, but you have governmental entities have a good defense on the philosophical discussion on how are we going to spend money, limited resources, in the best way possible. So probably pretty low liability on that question.
Chuck, did that answer your questions?
Yeah, well, yes.
Okay. Marty?
So, two things. One, the engineering firm did actually study the plans for each building. I don't know that we mentioned that, and I thought that was pretty important in what I had heard before. But at one point, there was the 10 million for reoccupancy of new construction, but that's not in here, that's separate.
That's built into the 620. This was just so that's the new standard. That's the price of the new construction. That's built in. This was the retrofit of the very high risk that we've been validating all along, and so the amount that we had thought was enough at the 56 million, it's really 57, so there's $1 million discrepancy.
Okay, Kathy?
So all the way through this, we haven't talked about what's built into that 620 as a contingency. Do we know what kind of contingency fund we've left and how much is it?
Yes. Yeah, we have, at the project level, we have a project contingency of about 5%. Some projects are higher risk, so there would be some projects, got a good example of one.
South Salem High School would be a good example. We have a 6% contingency built into it, higher risk project there.
Okay.
And then we also have a roll-up program contingency of 5% as well. And the reason that we've structured the program that way is because while you assess the risk at the project level, let's say you run into litigation. Now you have to have a program contingency to address that, because that's not something you could have anticipated at the project level. So the two play out over the course of the life of the bond. And prices increase, and that's another conversation that we'll have, not tonight, but either tomorrow night or Monday night. The escalation in the market has
I mean Thursday, we're not meeting.
I'm not
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. I'm doing something
Mike
tomorrow.
is, but the rest of us aren't. Okay.
I'll still be here. I'll be processing.
I'm not gonna be here, bud.
Okay.
Okay.
Anyone else? Question? Jesse?
I just wanted to know, what does the project contingency mean? What does that mean?
So those are for issues that it's basically a project risk fund. So there are things that, if you've ever done a home improvement project, it never goes the way you anticipate it.
Okay.
And we know that these projects will be no different, because that's what happens.
Got it. Okay.
Yep.
Awesome. That's good to know.
Just covers costs that you didn't anticipate in the actual scope, but they happen.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Anyone else? Question for Mike at this point? Seeing none? Is there more in this report on the seismic?
No, I have a question though. Is this a conversation you would like the engineers to be here for?
Sharon?
They came and spoke to us, or I can't remember. So on the task force, we had them come in, didn't we? Did we have them come in?
I don't know.
I spoke mostly on this.
We
Yeah.
had questions for
Yeah.
them about.
They didn't come to committee I was on.
Yeah, and then a lot of the questions were, are you qualified to?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
so I think the task force vetted them pretty well.
Okay. So
We had
we
a
could
lot of
practice our consensus model. So for those of you who would like them to come, that would be a thumbs up. Those of you who are willing to tolerate them coming, that would be a thumb sideways. And those of you who don't think they need to come, that could be a thumbs down. So I'm okay. Well, you're optimistic. Okay. So, well, that didn't decide a thing, except 3 of us don't really want them to come.
That's how 4.
You saw 4?
Yeah.
No.
4?
You were down, right? Yeah.
Okay, well, then we're 4.
I'll change mine.
You'll change yours down? All right.
Yeah, I'll do it down.
You'll do down, okay. I guess that leaves Kathy. Kathy, you want to meet with the engineers?
I've got no scruples.
I have like no good of a reason to.
Okay, do you want, Kathy, you're the holdout. No? Yes? Okay,
No, I'll trust everybody's
okay.
judgment.
All right. Well, we're
Okay,
trusting Mike's
we'll just-
judgment, so it's all on him.
Trusting the
Yeah.
engineer's license.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
The licensing
Yeah,
board.
exactly.
Yes, Mike.
So in the vein of guidance in the making,
Yes, Mike.
is there a desire by the board for staff to consider some of the high-risk structures when it makes sense to be included with a very high-risk structure as long as the cost doesn't exceed or come within 50% or so of the high-risk cost?
Marty?
It would make sense to do that, but yet on the other hand, what would we be giving away? And what would have to go away to keep us in the same area? And so maybe it'd be good to have that information for when we do the give and take to know, but we may choose not to do it because we may not want to give up something else.
Okay.
Okay.
That's
Jesse?
my opinion.
Okay,
I
Jesse?
think it'd be good for us to have time to look it over and really look at, because the numbers really help us take a look at what's going on.
Okay.
And then we can talk about it next time.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Now, as I look at so seismic is done for the moment. Okay. It's my understanding as I look at this that questions and comments, presentation materials, which we had, then there are questions and comments. Are there any burning questions from the materials that we received over the weekend that you want to ask about, say a costing item or something else? Kathy, that they could be getting ready for?
Lots of things that we talked about that we had comments on, at least that I have noticed, are on storage. It's athletic equipment and music equipment for the main part. Is there any reason we can't really cut costs by going to a relatively small pole building that's secure next to those classrooms in some cases?
I don't know.
I'm not understanding.
There's an occupancy issue that would have to be overcame with that. We have to meet an E-occupancy for educational occupancy. So using it for storage that's accessed on a regular basis would prove challenging to build a pole building that would meet that occupancy code. Fire sprinklers, fire alarm systems, these kinds of things, the way it's wired and things like that. The wiring would be fairly easy, but it would be very challenging to get a pole building to meet that for something that's going to be used on a regular, everyday basis, because it's truly not a storage building at that point. It's an extension of the classroom that they're getting their equipment in and out of every period potentially.
Well, it makes sense to build something less expensive than use it in hallways that are much more expensive or classroom space that we're using now. It just doesn't make sense. So secondly, can we use some of the portables that we're getting rid of, some of the best? Can those be relocated and designated for that kind of storage?
That's an interesting notion. We can take a look at those, yeah, for
Okay.
sure.
Okay. Jim?
So in the packet tonight, and it's the next thing, the bond staff community feedback on the second page, in the first paragraph. We got the first sentence, and then the next words are in total over, and I'm left hanging there.
Sorry,
How about-
I didn't pick up my.
How about we,
Next packet.
how about we,
One questions on packets.
Oh, yeah.
Question I got.
how about we
Total
strike
over.
that? That was me. How about we just strike those 3 words?
And you'll start with that on Thursday, right?
Sure.
Okay.
Or tomorrow with Mike.
With Mike will be here tomorrow. No, I'm not, no, on Thursday's
Looks
fine.
like
That's just, that's how it's
Okay.
supposed to be there.
What should be there is the number of attendees, which you'll find
Okay.
underneath that chart.
243,
So
240.
here's just briefly.
Mike.
This was, you received this format, but it was only the listening and learning forms
right.
already.
Right.
I cut and pasted and added conceptual design review so that you'd have it all in one page.
Okay.
And I forgot those 3 words, so they need to come off.
I was just wondering, I was waiting for.
Mike didn't let me edit it
I
before
did
it went into
not.
this book.
I
Yeah.
did not,
Thanks, Paul.
nor did I punch
Throw 'em
the
on
holes
another
in
list.
paper.
Deniability, leave Mike hanging. Okay, I got a couple other people. Kathy, you're on the list. Marty, did I see your?
So, yeah, 2 things. I've seen Waldo halls mentioned a few times. I'm thinking that's probably an expensive thing to increase hall size, but I was just curious what's wrong with Waldo halls compared to other middle schools? Are they more narrow? And is there anything that can be done that's reasonable in price?
Well, we'd have to, first of all, when we were looking at what the needs of the schools were, we were looking at supporting additional enrollment in the future. So Waldo would get classrooms and they would have other improvements, but going in and widening hallways
I'm thinking that's got to be
is not,
big cost.
not part of it, particularly if they're full of those clay tiles.
Right.
That's a whole nother conversation.
And then the other question also has to do with music, because, we're a music family, and I see that McKay has over $200,000 worth of equipment that's left out in the room. I'm wondering, what do the other high schools have? And is it equitable to what McKay has?
Same problems.
Do they have the same problem, or do they have the room to store their instruments?
One of the common themes, and we're sort of jumping into the next packet of information, so can we hold that for?
We can hold it.
Okay.
I'm fine with holding it if, we'll get to it next week, or Thursday.
You want that on the list to hear
Yeah.
about? Yep.
Or tomorrow night.
Yeah.
I'll be here.
Or Mike will be here tomorrow night, yeah.
Yeah, we could do a phone call tomorrow night if you want, but I'm not
There we
coming.
go. Jesse,
It is a common theme, though.
do you have something you want him to bring up on Thursday?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
just one, see a question here by a community member named P. Kyllo.
Yeah, I've heard of him.
Oh, yeah. But it says, can you address extra jobs created and the number of teachers employed if the bond passes?
For the
I think that'd be an
community.
awesome thing to be able to look at.
And that's one of the things. I reached out to the national school organizations to see what the national trend data looks like so that we can make sure that what our projections are fall in line with national trend lines on that.
Okay.
And Karma's been researching it too.
Okay.
And I think in addition, we can tap into some local resources like SEDCOR. The chamber may have some good numbers as far as what the churn of $1 is in the community. So we can definitely come up with those.
Okay. Kathy, you had one?
Yeah, that I wanted to add on the other one to do a little research on. What city codes say about parking? Can we make excess parking gravel? Do we have to pave it all? I mean, we hear it over and over again. We want, curb stops and all that crap. Can we?
Yeah, we do.
Any, Chuck? Chuck, okay, other people have thrown in. Chuck, you have something you want to throw in? Sharon? Okay, I have one I want to throw in. I want to know how much I want to know why and how much it's going to cost us if we agree to it to re-turf the South High School field.
Sure.
Since I'm not sure why we're re-turfing their field.
Okay, and would you like that
I would
conversation
like to know about that.
tomorrow night?
It's on the charts that that's in the bond
hasn't been
that we're
that
going
long.
to re-turf their field.
It's in
Yeah.
the bond?
It's in the packet for the
For South High
South
School.
High School.
I don't have to
Profile
raise
sheet.
money?
Sure is.
Why don't we
That's
put it in there?
why I'm asking
Yeah.
the question.
It's
We'll
not,
bring-
it shouldn't be in there.
It
That's,
isn't.
that's incorrect.
Well, it's there.
But we are not, well, I don't know how it got there, but thanks
Okay,
for pointing
that's
it
fine.
out.
I know,
We'll take
that's
it
why
out.
I'm just asking so we can
That's
talk
not,
about
that's a
that.
general fund.
Somebody slipped that in there.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah,
good.
it's a seismic issue. That's what it come down.
That was, I was thinking, but, okay.
Is there,
Are there any other questions or comments
I just have one question.
for Mike for Thursday?
Actually, probably more for the superintendent.
Oh, dear.
And I don't know if it's Thursday or
Tomorrow.
for you. Are we going to hear from the campaign at any point?
you can, at any point you want to. They're keeping tabs on our process and have been kind of eyeing that December 14th meeting. But I'll ask them if you'd, to say you're ready to hear from them.
Just,
Yep.
how's it going? Do we have, funds? Do we have things up and
Yep.
running? Those types of things.
Yep.
Questions.
I've been kind of the board liaison to that.
They've started.
Oh, yeah, there's-
Okay. Then, hearing nothing else, the next meeting, for clarification, will be Thursday, November 30th, 5 PM at the Lancaster Professional Center. Do we know the room, Alice? 101. It's on the first floor as you walk in the main doors. It will be inside a ways and to your left. Okay? So with that, unless there's any other points of business, I will declare us adjourned unless anyone wants to object. Good, no objections. We are adjourned.
Let's get consensus on that.
Hearing anything tonight.
Yeah, I was gonna say, consensus quickly.
Sure, Paul. I think